Chapter 6. 2 weeks before my death, I left the house later than usual, and by the time I reached the school, the blacktop circle where the school buses usually hovered was empty. A hall monitor from the discipline office would write down your name if you tried to get in the front doors after the first bell rang, and I didn't want to be paged during class to come and sit on the hard bench outside Mr. Peterford's room, where it was widely known he would bend you over and paddle your behind with a board. He'd asked the shop teacher to drill holes into it for less wind resistance on the downstroke, and more pain when it landed against your jeans. I had never been late enough or done anything bad enough to meet the board, but in my mind, as in every other kid's, I could visualize it so well my butt would sting. Clarissa had told me that the baby stoners, as they were called in junior high, used the back door to the stage, which was always left open by Cleo, the janitor, who had dropped out of high school as a full-blown stoner. So that day I crept into the backstage area, watching my step, careful not to trip over the various cords and wires. I paused near some scaffolding and put down my book bag to brush my hair. I'd taken to leaving the house in the Jingle Bell cap, and then switching as soon as I gained cover behind the O'Dwyer's house to an old black watch cap of my father's. All this left my hair full of static electricity, and my first stop was usually the girls' room, where I would brush it flat. "You are beautiful, Susie Salmon." I heard the voice, but could not place it immediately. I looked around me. "Here," the voice said. I looked up and saw the head and torso of Ray Singh leaning out over the top of the scaffold above me. "Hello," he said. I knew Ray Singh had a crush on me. He had moved from England the year before, but Clarissa said he was born in India. That someone could have the face of one country and the voice of another, and then move to a third, was too incredible for me to fathom. It made him incredibly cool. Plus, he seemed 800 times smarter than the rest of us, and he had a crush on me. What I finally realized were affections. The smoking jacket that he sometimes wore to school, and his foreign cigarettes, which were actually his mother's, I thought were evidence of his higher breeding. He knew and saw things that the rest of us didn't see. That morning, when he spoke to me from above, my heart plunged to the floor. "Hasn't the first bell rung?" I asked. "I had Mr. Morton for homeroom," he said. This explained everything. Mr. Morton had a perpetual hangover, which was at its peak during homeroom. He never called roll. "What are you doing up there?" "Climb up and see," he said, removing his head and shoulders from my view. I hesitated. "Come on, Susie." It was my one day in life of being a bad kid, of at least feigning the moves. I placed my foot on the bottom rung of the scaffold and reached my arms up to the first crossbar. "Bring your stuff," Ray advised. I went back for my book bag and then climbed unsteadily up. "Let me help you," he said, and put his hands under my armpits, which, even though covered by my winter parka, I was self-conscious about. I sat for a moment with my feet dangling over the side. "Tuck them in," he said. "That way no one will see us." I did what he told me, and then I stared at him for a moment. I felt suddenly stupid, unsure of why I was there. "Will you stay up here all day?" I asked. "Just until English class is over." "You're cutting English?" It was as if he'd said he'd robbed a bank. "I've seen every Shakespeare play put on by the Royal Shakespeare Company," Ray said. "That bitch has nothing to teach me." I felt sorry for Mrs. Jewett then. If part of being bad was calling Mrs. Jewett a bitch, I wasn't into it. "I like Othello," I ventured. "It's condescending twaddle the way she teaches it, a sort of black-like-me version of the Moor." Ray was smart. This, combined with being an Indian from England, made him a Martian in Norristown. "That guy in the movie looked pretty stupid with the black makeup on," I said. "You mean Sir Laurence Olivier?" Ray and I were quiet enough to hear the bell for the end of homeroom ring, and then, 5 minutes later, the bell that meant we should be on the first floor in Mrs. Jewett's class. As every second passed after that bell, I could feel my skin heat up and Ray's look lengthen out over my body, taking my royal blue parka and my Kelly green miniskirt with my matching Dan skin tights. My real shoes sat beside me inside my bag. On my feet I had a pair of fake sheepskin boots with dirty synthetic shearing spilling out like animal innards around the tops and seams. If I had known this was to be the sex scene of my life, I might have prepared a bit, reapplied my strawberry banana kissing potion as I came in the door. I could feel Ray's body leaning toward me, the scaffolding underneath us squeaking from his movement. He is from England, I was thinking. His lips moved closer, the scaffold listed. I was dizzy. I was about to go under the wave of my first kiss when we both heard something. We froze. Ray and I lay down side by side and stared at the lights and wires overhead. A moment later, the stage door opened and in walked Mr. Peterford and the art teacher, Miss Ryan, who we recognised by their voices. There was a third person with them. "We are not taking disciplinary action at this time, but we will if you persist," Mr. Peterford was saying. "Miss Ryan, did you bring the materials?" "Yes." Miss Ryan had come to Kennet from a Catholic school and taken over the art department from 2 ex-hippies who had been fired when the kiln exploded. Our art classes had gone from wild experiments with molten metals and throwing clay day after day of drawing profiles of wooden figures she placed in stiff positions at the beginning of each class. "I'm only doing the assignments." It was Ruth Connors. I recognised the voice, and so did Ray. We all had Mrs. Jewett's English class first period. This, Mr. Peterford said, was not the assignment. Ray reached for my hand and squeezed. We knew what they were talking about. A Xerox copy of one of Ruth's drawings had been passed around in the library until it had reached a boy at the card catalogue who was overtaken by the librarian. "If I'm not mistaken," said Miss Ryan, "there are no breasts on our anatomy model." The drawing had been of a woman reclining with her legs crossed, and it was no wooden figure with eye hooks connecting the limbs. It was a real woman, and the charcoal smudges of her eyes, whether by accident or intent, had given her a leering look that made every kid who saw it either highly uncomfortable or quite happy, thank you. "There isn't a nose or mouth on that wooden model either," Ruth said, "but you encouraged us to draw in faces." Again Ray squeezed my hand. "That's enough, young lady," Mr. Peterford said. "It is the attitude of repose in this particular drawing that clearly made it something the Nelson boy would Xerox. Is that my fault? Without the drawing there would be no problem. So it's my fault. I invite you to realise the position this puts the school in, and to assist us by drawing what Miss Ryan instructs the class to draw without making unnecessary additions." "Leonardo da Vinci drew cadavers," Ruth said softly. "Understood?" "Yes," said Ruth. The stage doors opened and shut, and a moment later Ray and I could hear Ruth Connors crying. Ray mouthed the word "go," and I moved to the end of the scaffold, dangling my feet over the side to find a hold. That week, Ray would kiss me by my locker. It didn't happen up on the scaffold when he'd wanted it to. Our only kiss was like an accident, a beautiful gasoline rainbow. I climbed down off the scaffold with my back to her. She didn't move or hide, just looked at me when I turned around. She was sitting on a wooden crate near the back of the stage. A pair of old curtains hung to her left. She watched me walk towards her, but didn't wipe her eyes. "Susie Salmon," she said, just to confirm it. The possibility of my cutting first period and hiding backstage in the auditorium was, until that day, as remote as the smartest girl in our class being bawled out by the discipline officer. I stood in front of her, hat in hand. "That's a stupid hat," she said. I lifted the jingle bell cap and looked at it. "I know, my mum made it." "So you heard. Can I see?" Ruth unfolded the much-handled Xerox and I stared. Using a blue ballpoint pen, Brian Nelson had made an obscene hole where her legs were crossed. I recalled, and she watched me. I could see something flicker in her eyes, a private wondering, and then she leaned over and brought out a black leather sketchbook from her knapsack. Inside, it was beautiful. Drawings of women mostly, but of animals and men too. I'd never seen anything like it before. Each page was covered in her drawings. I realized how subversive Ruth was then. Not because she drew pictures of new women that got misused by her peers, but because she was more talented than her teachers. She was the quietest kind of rebel. Helpless, really. "You're really good, Ruth," I said. "Thank you," she said, and I kept looking through the pages of her book, drinking it in. I was both frightened and excited by what existed beneath the black line of the navel in those drawings, what my mother called the baby-making machinery. I told Lindsay I'd never have one, and when I was 10, I'd spent the better part of 6 months telling any adult who would listen that I intended on getting my tubes tied. I didn't know what this meant exactly, but I knew it was drastic, required surgery, and it made my father laugh out loud. Ruth went from weird to special to me then. The drawings were so good that in that moment I forgot the rules of school, all the bells and whistles, which as kids we were supposed to respond to. After the cornfield was roped off, searched, then abandoned, Ruth went walking there. She would wrap a large wool shawl of her grandmother's around her under the ratty old peacoat of her father's. Soon she noted that teachers and subjects beside Jim didn't report her if she cut. They were happy not to have her there. Her intelligence made her a problem. It demanded attention and rushed their lesson plans forward. And she began to take rides from her father in the mornings to avoid the bus. He left very early and brought his red metal sloped top lunchbox, which he had allowed her to pretend was a barn for Barbies when she was little, and in which he now tucked a bourbon. Before he left her out in the empty parking lot, he would stop his truck but keep the heater running. "Going to be okay today?" he always asked. Ruth nodded. "One for the road?" And without nodding this time, she handed him the lunchbox. He opened it, unscrewed the bourbon, took a deep swallow, and then passed it to her. She threw her head back dramatically, and either placed her tongue against the glass so very little would make it to her mouth, or took a small wincing gulp if he was watching her. She slid out of the high cab. It was cold, bitterly cold, before the sun rose. Then she remembered a fact from one of our classes. People moving are warmer than people at rest. So she began to walk directly to the cornfield, keeping a good pace. She talked to herself, and sometimes she thought about me. Often she would rest a moment against the chain-link fence that separated the soccer field from the track, while she watched the world come alive around her. So we met each morning in those first few months. The sun would come up over the cornfield, and Holiday, let loose by my father, would come to chase rabbits in and out of the tall, dry stalks of dead corn. The rabbits loved the trimmed lawns of the athletic fields, and as Ruth approached, she'd see their dark forms line up along the white chalk of the farthest boundary, like some sort of tiny sports team. She liked the idea of this, and I did too. She believed stuffed animals moved at night when humans went to sleep. She still thought in her father's lunchbox there might be miniature cows and sheep that found time to graze on the bourbon and bologna. When Lindsay left the gloves for Christmas for me, in between the farthest boundary of the soccer field and the cornfield, I looked down one morning to see the rabbits investigate, sniff at the corners of the gloves lined with their own kin. Then I saw Ruth pick them up before Holiday grabbed them. She turned the bottom of one glove so the fur faced out, and held it up to her cheek. She looked up to the sky and said, "Thank you." I liked to think she was talking to me. I grew to love Ruth on those mornings, feeling that in some way we could never explain on our opposite sides of the in-between, we were born to keep each other company. Odd girls who had found each other in the strangest way, in the shiver she had felt when I passed.